You hear the name Einstein, you immediately think genius, right? But what if you could actually hold the secret to that genius in your hands? What if it was just a physical object? Well, get ready, because we're about to dive into one of the weirdest, most fascinating stories in the entire history of science.
So, let's set the scene. It's 1955. Einstein is on his deathbed, and he is totally clear-headed about what he wants. He refuses surgery, saying, "I have done my share, it is time to go." He was also really specific about what should happen next: cremate his body, scatter the ashes in secret. The absolute last thing he wanted was for his body or his brain to be worshipped. But what happens when someone just decides to ignore all of that? When one man makes a decision that goes completely against Einstein's final wishes? Well, that single choice kicked off this unbelievable, decades-long saga. And it's a story that forces us to ask some really tough questions, not just about science, but about ethics and what genius even is.
All right, let's get into it. Part 1, the brain's bizarre journey.
So, meet the man at the center of this whole thing, Dr. Thomas Harvey. He was the pathologist on duty at Princeton Hospital when Einstein passed away. And during the autopsy, he does something pretty incredible. He removes Einstein's brain without permission. He just takes it. In his mind, he was preserving it for science, totally convinced it held the key to unlocking the secrets of genius.
Now, Harvey did eventually get a kind of reluctant, after-the-fact permission from Einstein's son, but the journey from there, oh man, it is wild. The brain gets cut into 240 little blocks. Then, it basically disappears for over 20 years until a reporter tracks it down in 1978. The first study on it isn't even published until 1985. And get this, in '97, Harvey literally takes the brain on a road trip across the country. It wasn't until 2010 that the pieces finally found a permanent home.
And this part just blows my mind. We are talking about Albert Einstein's brain. You'd think it'd be in some high-tech, secure lab. Nope. For decades, it was literally floating in formaldehyde in a couple of mason jars, stashed inside an old cider box in a basement. You just can't make this stuff up.
Okay, so after all that weirdness, scientists finally get their hands on these brain fragments. So the big question is, can they actually find anything? Can the physical anatomy of his brain tell us why he was a genius?
Well, the very first thing they discovered was a total surprise. Einstein's brain was actually a little bit smaller than the average male brain. So right off the bat, that old idea that a bigger brain means a smarter person, thrown right out the window. If there was a secret to his genius, it wasn't about size. It had to be something more subtle, something in the way it was built.
And they did find some really interesting quirks. For one, he had way more glial cells than usual. You can think of these as the support crew for your neurons. They keep everything nourished and running efficiently. Then, his parietal lobes, which are crucial for math and spatial thinking, were 15% wider than average. He was even missing a common groove in that area, which might have meant his neurons could communicate more directly. And on top of all that, his corpus callosum was exceptionally thick.
Let's zoom in on that last one, because it's a big deal. The corpus callosum is basically the superhighway connecting the two halves of your brain, your logical side and your creative side. So having a thinker one is like having a bigger, faster highway. It could mean that information was just flowing back and forth much more efficiently, allowing him to connect ideas in ways most of us can't.
So you can see how researchers started putting this puzzle together, right? The wider parietal lobes, well, that's his math talent. That missing groove, maybe that explains why he always said he thought in pictures. They even found features that they linked to his skill as a violinist. It really started to look like this perfect, neat little package, a biological blueprint for genius.
But you know how it is in science. It's never that simple. Just when it seemed like we had an answer, a huge wave of skepticism started to roll in.
And this is the question that changes everything. Okay, so his brain was different, but does that prove those differences are what caused him to be a genius?
The pushback from other scientists really came down to a few major problems. First, they said, look, everyone's brain is unique. How do we know these aren't just random quirks? The second, and maybe the biggest problem, is the sample size. It's one, you just can't draw real scientific conclusions from a single case study. And third, everyone knew they were studying Einstein's brain. That creates a huge risk of bias. They were looking for signs of genius, so of course they were more likely to find things that could interpret that way.
This quote from a cognitive neuroscientist, Chris Chambers, just nails the problem. He said that studying Einstein's brain is like reading Nostradamus. You can basically make it say whatever you want it to say. It just shows that without more data, without a control group, you can't really prove anything.
So if the science is shaky, was this whole 50-year journey a waste of time? Not at all, because what we ended up learning might be even more interesting. It's not really about Einstein's brain, it's about us.
There's this great quote often attributed to Einstein himself. Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. And that feels like the perfect takeaway here, doesn't it? Maybe we were looking in the wrong place. Maybe genius isn't something you can measure with calipers.
When you really think about it, this whole quest says way more about our society than it does about Albert Einstein. We are obsessed with the idea of genius. We want it to be simple, something we can physically point to and say, aha, that's it. We're desperate for a biological shortcut to explain something so incredibly complex.
And that's why this story is still so powerful. It leaves us with these huge, important questions. We start with the obvious one, consent and ethics, but it gets so much deeper. Are people born geniuses, or do they become them? How far should we let neuroscience go? And maybe the biggest question of all, how much of what makes you you is just the physical stuff in your head?
So, in the end, we're left with that ultimate chicken or the egg question, the timeless nature versus nurture debate. Was Einstein born with a special brain that was destined for greatness? Or did a lifetime of intense thinking, of pondering the very nature of the universe, actually change the physical structure of his brain? The truth is, we still don't know. And maybe, just like the man himself, that mystery is part of what makes the story so compelling.